10 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3.
Now the Contenders, our 14-week series on key political figures who ran for president and lost, but who nevertheless changed political history. We feature former governor of Alabama and four-time presidential candidate George Wallace. This program was recorded at the governor's mansion in Montgomery, Alabama. It's about 2 hours. And each Sunday at this time through Labor Day weekend, you can watch the Contenders here on American History TV on C-SPAN 3.
Good evening and welcome to the Contenders. Tonight, we come to you live from the governor's mansion in Montgomery, Alabama, as we look at the life and times of four-time presidential candidate George Wallace. Elected four times as governor of Alabama, George Wallace called this house behind us home for 20% of his life. Now, before we begin our conversation on George Wallace and his legacy and introduce you to our guests, here's a look at his political style.
And I said, if you can't distinguish at Harvard between honest dissent and overt acts of treason, then you ought to come on down to Alabama and we'll teach you some law down there, because y'all don't know some of it at Harvard. Both national parties in the last number of years have kowtowed to every group of anarchists that have roamed the streets of San Francisco and Los Angeles and throughout the country. And now they've created themselves a Frankenstein monster, and the chickens are coming home to roost all over this country. I love you too, I sure do. Oh, I thought you were a she, you a he, oh my goodness. And when he was in California, a group of anarchists lay down in front of his automobile and threatened his personal safety, the President of the United States. Well, I want to tell you, if you'll elect me the president and I go to California, or I come to Arkansas and some of them lie down in front of my automobile, it'll be the last one they'll ever want to lie down in front of.
And now we're joined here in the governor's mansion, in front of the governor's mansion in Montgomery, Alabama, 2 miles south of downtown Montgomery, by Dan Carter, biographer of George Wallace. The Politics of Rage is his book. Dr. Carter, in your book, you describe George Wallace as the most influential loser of the 20th century. What do you mean by that?
Well, certainly of the 20th century and the period since the World War II, the rise of conservatism, I can't think of anyone who was more influential, not so much in creating ideas, but in showing that there was a tremendous amount of support in the country for what was at that time not seen as very important, the new conservatism as it ultimately evolved.
What is the new conservatism?
Well, it went through several, it metamorphized over the years, but at least in the early stages, it was very closely linked with the activism of the federal government, and particularly the flashpoint was the civil rights movement. I mean, that's where George Wallace got his start, but it was something that was far broader than simply what was happening in the South.
George Wallace was first elected governor of Alabama in 1962. Where did he come from?
Barber County, which was one of the most politically active counties in areas of Alabama. As somebody said, there wasn't much to do except get involved in politics, so that's what George Wallace did, and he turned out to be very good at it. Coming back after World War II, having served as an engineer, B-29 engineer, flying in the Pacific, he ran for the state legislature, easily won, was an up-and-coming figure, then was elected judge, and was so popular he decided to run for governor.
And this is 1958?
1958. And the problem was he ran as a moderate. And
what's a moderate in Alabama?
Well, a moderate in Alabama in 1958 was somebody who emphasized law and order. Certainly Governor Wallace, or as he was later to be Governor Wallace, was a segregationist just as much as his opponent John Patterson. But there were kind of nuances you had to listen for. And when Judge Wallace, as he was then, emphasized that he was going to uphold the law and criticized his opponent for having the backing of the Ku Klux Klan, that was a way of saying to voters, look, I'm a segregationist, but I'm a rational segregationist, and I'm not going to lead us into violence. And that was essentially the way he was perceived, and he lost.
He lost in the Democratic primary, which at that time
was tantamount to being elected. And John Patterson ran, as he himself said later on, as a stronger segregationist candidate, and that's why Wallace lost. And at that point, I think he faced a critical kind of crossroads in his career. There's no place for him to go except to tap into the rising tide of anti-government conservatism, which was at that time built around the civil rights movement. And then he's elected easily in 1962.
What did he change?
Well, he became the stronger, much stronger proponent of segregation. And essentially, later on, we associate him with the stand in the schoolhouse door. I will stand in the schoolhouse door to prevent the integration of any schools, higher education, lower education in Alabama. And that's exactly what he did, although he had to back out of the door pretty quickly.
Dan Carter, he ran for president in 1964 after 2 years of governor,
right,
as governor of Alabama.
Right. And when he ran in 1964 in the Democratic primary, Lyndon Johnson had become president after the assassination of John Kennedy. And Johnson insisted he was too busy, so he didn't actually run as a candidate, but he had a series of surrogates around the country in the Democratic primaries. And when Wallace announced that he was going to run in the Democratic primary, no one paid any attention to it. It got about 2 paragraphs in the New York Times. And when he went to Wisconsin, northern state, in 1964, the governor predicted there, the Democratic governor, he won't get 1% of the vote. Well, he got 33% of the vote. It stunned everyone. And I think it was at that moment that the pundits, political observers, realized that the separation between the South, what was going on in the South, was not just Southern, because clearly there was a constituency for someone like George Wallace, an avowed segregationist from the South.
George Wallace ran for president in 1964, 1968, 1972, and 1976. In 1968, he won 5 states and 46 electoral votes. That's the last time an independent candidate has won any electoral votes. Here's George Wallace announcing in 1968.
For over a year, I have repeatedly stated that one of the existing political parties must offer the people of this country a real choice in 1968, or that I would lead a political effort which would in fact offer this choice. I have traveled throughout our country in the last year, literally from Concord, New Hampshire, to Los Angeles, California, and to Miami, Florida. And the American people are hungry for a change in the direction of our national government. They are concerned and disturbed about the trends being followed by our national leadership. There has been no response from either of the parties which would show the American people that they are heeding the growing disillusionment with what amounts to a one-party system in the United States. No prospective candidate of the 2 existing parties, nor anyone in party leadership positions, have come forward with any indication that there will be any difference in their platforms. No one has suggested that the wishes of the American people will be heard. So today I state to you that I am a candidate for President of the United States. My wife, the governor of Alabama, joins me in this decision. My wife and I together, in making this announcement, are carrying out our commitment to the people of Alabama made during her campaign in the year 1966. I am in the race irreparably. I will run to win. And we will, of course, discuss in depth, as time goes on, the issues and our solutions to problems that face the American people.
Dan Carter, why was George Wallace so successful in 1968?
Well, he was successful for the reason that he was usually successful, and that was he had an almost unnatural ability to size up both the audiences he spoke to and public opinion. A couple of pollsters used to say, I always listened to what Governor Wallace was going to say because I knew the next time I polled, that's the way it was going to poll. And that may be a slight exaggeration, but he was certainly aware that whereas 64 may have seemed a kind of flash in the pan revolving around the Civil Rights Act and the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, that was the main issue then. By 1968, you've had riots in the cities, you've had the anti-war movement, you've had a general reaction throughout the country as Americans realized that the Civil Rights movement not only was having an impact in the South, but the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 was going to affect the rest of the country as well, everything from housing to jobs. And suddenly there was this constituency that he knew that was out there opposed to the activities of the federal government, and particularly the role of the courts, the role of the presidency under Johnson and his very assertive Great Society. And he knew that that as an independent candidate, he also had the possibility, and it was a long shot. He didn't think he was going to win secretly, I think, but he knew there was at least a possibility that he'd be able to get enough votes as a third-party candidate to throw that election into the House of Representatives, something that hadn't been done well over 100 years.
Was that his goal?
Publicly, he was always running for president. He was going to be elected. But I think deep down he was pretty realistic, and he realized that was a long shot in 1968. But he was also thinking about 1972. So even if he didn't win in 1968, he saw himself as stronger by 72.
He was not governor at the time in 1968 when he was running, correct?
No, his wife, Lurleen Wallace, who had been elected in his place in 1966 because he couldn't succeed himself at that time, tragically died in office, and Albert Brewer succeeded her and supported him in that campaign. So he wasn't governor, but he did have the support of the state of Alabama pretty successfully.
What was happening in April 1968 when Martin Luther King was assassinated? What was George Wallace's reaction? What did he do?
He made perfunctory remarks about how tragic this was, and talked about it a couple of times. He really didn't respond publicly very much. He responded earlier much more to the assassination of John Kennedy, despite the fact that he always used Kennedy as a foil, for example, in the stand in the schoolhouse door, trying to keep out black students in 1963. He admired Kennedy and really respected him. And when Kennedy was assassinated, it disturbed him deeply, I think, in part because he realized that the assassination of a public figure like Kennedy could happen to him as well.
Well, you've got a picture in your book, The Politics of Rage, Dan Carter, of President Kennedy touring Alabama in 1963.
Right.
Not a picture that JFK wanted to have published.
No, he made every effort to make sure that he was not photographed side by side with George Wallace. And it's for him, it was politics. I mean, it wasn't, he may have not have liked Wallace. In some ways, his brother, particularly Robert, admired his political skills. He didn't like him, but he realized that politically this was not going to do him any good to have his picture next to Governor Wallace there.
And there is the picture. You can see it was taken by a long lens. JFK getting off the helicopter and greeting Governor Wallace. What was his reaction in June 1968 when RFK was shot?
Again, he really didn't like Robert Kennedy. They had a number of disagreements. They had met actually at some great length in the months preceding the stand in the schoolhouse door. And so once again, he used it to talk about the rise of lawlessness in America. But I don't think he was really deeply touched by it at all.
Dan Carter, in 1968, how serious did President Nixon and Hubert Humphrey take George Wallace?
Well, Humphrey, of course, worried about him because he saw him as potentially pulling votes. But as time went on in that campaign, he's third-party candidate. Hubert Humphrey is the Democratic candidate, Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate. I think Humphrey came to realize that Wallace was going to be pulling votes from Nixon. So he didn't worry about him as much. Nixon was the one that came to be deeply concerned about it. As the campaign opened, Nixon was so far ahead in the polls that it was only by the time you got to late September that he began to realize, whoa, Humphrey's moving back a little bit, coming up in the polls, and now Wallace is pulling close to 20% of the vote, that is in the polls. And these are my voters, his political advisors felt. And so he had to try to figure out a way to get the support of the Wallace voters without directly attacking him.
President Nixon won in 1968, 31.7 million votes. He got 301 electoral votes. Hubert Humphrey, 31.3 million votes and 191 electoral votes. And George Wallace received nearly 10 million votes and 46 electoral votes. Here's George Wallace discussing the 68 campaign, the road to victory.
The strong support we have in our region of the country from whence this movement originated gives us an excellent base to go forth on the day of November the 5th with. And we, in my judgment, will go forth in the beginning with at least the 177 electoral vote that comprise the states of the South and border. And when you couple that with just a few other states of the Union, then you have the 270-odd electoral vote necessary to win the presidency. So no new party movement has ever had the grassroots support that our movement has. The other movements are movements of personalities, or some small group who represented only a small fraction of the voting public. But our movement does represent, in my judgment, the majority thinking of the American people at this moment, and will represent it November the 5th.
And we are back live in Montgomery, Alabama. That's a live picture of the governor's mansion, 2 miles south of downtown Montgomery. Dan Carter, how is it that George Wallace got 10 million votes and 46 electoral votes? In which 5 states did he win in 68?
Well, he won. All of his states that he won were in the Deep South. And to him, actually, that was a disappointment, because he had hoped to break into some of the border states. And he was close in a number of them, in North Carolina, in Virginia, and particularly in Tennessee. He was within striking distance. Although he was disappointed, it's an extraordinary showing. I mean, no political candidate had, third-party candidate since Strom Thurmond back in 1948 had even carried enough votes in a state to take the electoral votes. And he saw it as a strategy that didn't succeed, but one that was sound, I think, in 1968.
We want to get you involved in this program on the Contenders this week, the legacy of George Wallace. 202 is the area code, 737-0001 for those of you in the East and Central time zones, 202-737-0002 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zone. So go ahead and start dialing in, and we will get to those calls in just a minute. Last week on the Contenders, we talked about Hubert Humphrey, and so much of the discussion was about the Vietnam War. Yeah. Can you talk about George Wallace without talking about segregation and civil rights?
Sure. I mean, he had positions, and often quite popular positions, on social issues, for example. He was the first candidate, first person, I should say, to testify in favor of a constitutional amendment guaranteeing school prayer against a Supreme Court decision. He talked an awful lot about pornography and the dangers of pornography. But it was a mixed, you have to remember, this is the 1960s and 70s. For example, he supported Roe v. Wade. He came out in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment when it was first proposed. So at this time, yes, there were these social issues, but they didn't have that hard edge that they were later to have in the 1980s and 1990s there. But the Vietnam one was a particularly interesting one, because most conservatives took the position that Barry Goldwater did, victory at any cost. And Wallace, I think, Governor Wallace sense that the American people were very ambivalent about that war. And on the one hand, he wanted to appeal to the hardliners, and the way he did it was by coming up with this formulation. Either we go in, we win at any cost, or we pull out. And that way he sort of had both sides of it.
What was he known for as governor of Alabama? He was elected 4 times. Did he ever have a close contest?
A lot of the support, of course, stemmed from the race issue. There's no question about it. He was, Alabamians, and I think many white Southerners, felt besieged. And here you had someone, Governor Wallace was their champion. And they saw him as the kind of person who would speak up on their behalf, not apologetically, but very, very forcefully. So that was, I think that was part of it. The other part was that you have to remember, George Wallace came out of the 1930s as a Franklin Roosevelt liberal. He'd been very liberal in the state legislature, and so he did have a program which was often abused, but it was a program which emphasized increases in education, the establishment of community colleges around the state that would give access to individuals who couldn't afford to go to Auburn or the University of Alabama, but they could attend a community college for a couple of years, maybe get a tech degree or whatever. So education was a big part of it. But I think the sort of underlying force of this passion for Governor Wallace was, at least in the 60s, was the race issue.
Our first call on George Wallace comes from Freeland, Michigan. Freeland, Michigan, you are on the Contenders. We're live from Montgomery, Alabama.
Thank you very much. What appeal did Governor Wallace have to white ethnic and religious groups like Italians, Jews, Irish, etc., outside of the South and the urban areas? And also, what did he think of Senator Goldwater, since Senator Goldwater was also against the civil rights stuff? Thank you very much.
He did have a remarkable appeal to ethnics, particularly first-generation Eastern Europeans, other ethnics. He didn't have the baggage of being anti-Semitic and of being anti-foreign. And what he found was, particularly in many of the urban areas of the North, was he found that the very prosperity of the 1950s and 60s had created tension between blacks and ethnics in these working class communities in which African Americans were finally getting jobs, finally getting housing, and they were often moving in and conflicting directly with these working class ethnic neighborhoods.
Dan Carter, so much was going on with civil rights in Alabama during his first tenure as governor, 1963 to 1967, including the bombing of the church in Birmingham and the killing of the 4 young girls.
Yes.
What did he do? What was his reaction to that?
That was one of the most difficult moments, I think, for him at the time. And I don't doubt one moment that he was genuinely horrified, particularly when it happened. And he told Al Lingo, who was head of the state police, do what you have to do to find out who did this. It changed. I think partly because Governor Wallace reacted as he often did when he felt under attack, and that was to fight back. And so after a few weeks, although he continued to insist that he was trying to get to the bottom of this, he often then claimed, or at least privately claimed to many individuals, that maybe blacks had set these bombs or communists had set these bombs. And it showed how difficult it was, I think, for him to deal with it, but it was not his finest hour, I don't think.
What was his relationship with Bull Connor?
An ambivalent one. Partly because Connor was a kind of a loose cannon, and Wallace liked to feel like that the people that he was working closely with, he had control over, or at least could control them. But he certainly found Bull Connor a very useful kind of ally during the height of the civil rights movement in the Birmingham demonstrations. And he never made any real effort to rein Connor in during that period.
George Wallace served as governor of this state of Alabama from 1963 to 1967, then again from 1971 to 1979, and his final term 1983 to 1987. Total of 16 years. He died when he was 79 years old, so he lived in this mansion behind us for 20% of his life. Next call comes from Ken in San Diego. Hi, Ken.
Good evening. I wanted to know what kind of relationship did Governor Wallace have with Lyndon Johnson. Apparently, Lyndon Johnson was known to persuade people. And when did George Wallace finally abandon his philosophy of segregation? Thank you.
The Lyndon Johnson one, I guess the most famous moment between Lyndon Johnson and Governor Wallace came in the midst of the Selma crisis, the March to Selma, in which President Johnson brought him to Washington, or actually Governor Wallace very foolishly volunteered to meet with him, where he got the full treatment from Lyndon Johnson, was pretty intimidated by the whole process. But he wasn't alone in that respect. I mean, Lyndon Johnson intimidated everyone. And that was in, of course, in the early 60s. The last hurrah for the kind of racial campaign came in 1970 against Albert Brewer, who had been actually one of his proteges, who had replaced his wife as governor. And in the wake of that campaign, it was a pretty all-out use of the race issue, attacks that Brewer was a candidate of blacks. In the aftermath of it, politically, he said to many of his aides, "This is the last campaign we'll ever be able to run like this." The mood was changing, the public white voters were changing to some extent, and black voters were fully enfranchised at that point. As to when he emotionally changed, that I think really comes later on.
As we discussed with Dan Carter a little earlier, George Wallace ran for governor in 1958 and lost, won in 1962. Here's a little bit from his speeches in 58 and 62.
And I want to tell the good people of this state, as a judge of the Third Judicial Circuit, if I didn't have what it took to treat a man fair, regardless of his color, then I don't have what it takes to be the governor of your great state.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Dan Carter, the power of those words, from January 14, 1963.
Pretty amazing. And it really got him the first serious national attention. His aides worked very hard to make sure that all the networks were there. And it transformed. It was the first stage, along with the Stand in the Schoolhouse Door, that I think took him out of the position of being a narrow, parochial Southern politician and put him on the national stage. That speech was written by Asa Carter, one of his unofficial aides, who had been a Klansman and a right-wing political activist in the Citizens Council in the 50s, and later, of course, became, under the name of Forrest Carter, the writer of a number of best-selling novels. But he was the one that wrote that speech, pulling together ideas from a lot of other people, and it caught people's attention.
Danny in Mississippi, you're on the Contenders. Please go ahead with your question or comment.
Thank you, gentlemen. My question is, as far-fetched as it might seem, what if George Wallace would have been elected president. And I know there would have been compromise on both sides, but do you think that he would have been a good president? Would the people have supported him? And I'll hang up and listen to what you gentlemen say. Thank you.
Well, the only time that he even, I think, really stood a chance of being elected was not in 1968, but 72, and it would have been an extraordinarily long shot. Certainly, he would have been a different president than he was a campaigner. I can't imagine him being an effective president because although there were always 20-25% of the American people, mostly white Americans, who supported him, he always had the great hostility of well over half of the American people. It'd be hard to govern under those circumstances, no matter how well-intentioned you were.
Dan Carter, was George Wallace religious?
Oh, yes. I mean, he was a lifelong Methodist, and it's interesting, during these years, the 60s and 70s, he did, about the only time he ever talked about religion, even in an indirect way, was when he ran in 62. He did talk about, he was taking liquor out of the governor's mansion because Big Jim Folsom, his old mentor, had not taken liquor out of the governor's mansion. And so he talked about it in terms of being a Christian, that he was going to do it. But it's a totally different kinds of use of religion in the 60s and 70s. Politicians just didn't do that really during that period.
With all the campaigns he ran, did he enjoy politics? Hubert Humphrey, the happy warrior. Sure. Al Smith, the happy warrior.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he wouldn't have been as successful, I don't think. Any really good politician, I think, has to at least more than tolerate it. And in his case, you'd have to be a psychiatrist to figure out each politician, but I think he loved the adulation of the crowd, and it was a kind of love affair between him and many of his constituents. He was enormously popular among, particularly here in Alabama, and he loved that feeling of people supporting him.
Here's a little bit more from his 1963 first gubernatorial inaugural address.
Each race, within its own framework, has the freedom to teach, to instruct, to develop, to ask for and receive deserved help from others of separate racial stations. This is the great freedom of our American founding fathers. But if we amalgamate into the one unit, as advocated by the communist philosophers, then the enrichment of our lives, the freedom of our development, is gone forever. We become, therefore, a mongrel unit of one under a single all-powerful government, and we stand for everything and for nothing. The true brotherhood of America, of respecting the separateness of others and united in effort, has been so twisted and distorted from its original concept that there is small wonder that communism is today winning the world. We invite the Negro citizens of Alabama to work with us from his separate racial station, as we will work with him to develop, to grow in individual freedom and enrichment. We want jobs and a good future for both races. We want to help the physically and mentally sick of both races, the tubercular and the infirm. This is the basic heritage of my religion, of which I make full practice, for we are all the handiwork of God.
Dan Carter, that was from the same speech as Segregation Now, Segregation Tomorrow. Was he moderating his position? What was he doing?
Well, it's hard to know. He did make a few changes from the original, and that doesn't sound like Asa Carter. That sounds more like George Wallace, but it is an attempt to, I think, take a little bit of the edge off the harshness of the speech itself. It's an interesting part of that speech, and it only has one line there, but it becomes a constant motif, and that is a reference to communism. We don't think about that so much today in terms of anything except the Cold War and spies, but to white Southerners and to many Americans around the country, the civil rights movement was the handiwork of communists. And it's hard to recreate today just how frightened Americans were and how much they believed that communist infiltration had taken place, and civil rights seemed to be a logical place that they would be operating. And it became a very useful weapon against the movement to emphasize that.
George Wallace's running mate in 1968 was Air Force General Curtis LeMay. Our next call comes from Harry in Oakland, Maryland. Harry, good evening.
How you doing?
Good.
Hey, the reason I'm calling is I can remember in '72, as a college student at Allegheny College in Maryland, Cumberland, Maryland. I didn't see him, but he came to the campus one day, and then it was the following day he was shot at the Laurel Mall. And what I can remember of that, things that I read about, something that doesn't seem to be talked about much, you hit on a little bit, is he did go through a major transition after that. And things I've read since then, you said talk about religion, that he did talk openly, much more openly about it, and actually some sort of religious conversion somewhat, or whatever you call it, because of the problems he had. But also, I can remember seeing him receive an award from Alabama's NAACP. That was in, I think, his last term as governor. Am I wrong on that or not? Because I can remember actually watching that, and I was amazed to see the transformation, from a segregationist to basically receiving that type of recognition.
All right, Harry, thank you very much. And we're going to be discussing all of that throughout the evening on the Contenders. But Dan Carter, give us a snapshot of what Harry was asking about.
Well, it is clear that if you want to know what happens in terms of whites' attitude toward race, simply follow George Wallace's career. Yes, he was an ardent segregationist using the race issue in the 1960s. But by the 70s, and particularly after he was nearly assassinated, was wounded, and then as the whole political structure changed and blacks came to play a larger and larger role in the Democratic Party, both politically and I think in his own thinking, yes, he was a different person.
Very quickly, the 1972 campaign, how was he doing prior to getting shot?
It's amazing to think about it. George Wallace in 1972 was outpolling everyone up through May in the primaries. George McGovern had emerged as probably, in the eyes of the national media, as the candidate. He had sort of brushed aside the other candidates. But in terms of votes, until the day he was shot, Governor Wallace had considerably more votes than George McGovern did.
Next call for our guest, Dan Carter, who is the author of this book, The Politics of Rage: The Origins of the New Conservatism and the Transformation of American Politics, comes from Seeley Lake, Montana. Charles, you're on the Contenders on C-SPAN.
Yes, I was wondering about his if he was influenced by Huey P. Long at all, or did he ever think about running for federal office, like Senate or the House? Well, most likely the Senate. Well, thank you.
No, he's claimed he wasn't influenced by Long at all. I think that's probably unlikely. He was certainly familiar with the career of Long, and he really wasn't interested in running for the United States Senate. I think he could easily have been elected. At one time he talked about it and thought about it, but he was really much more comfortable in Alabama. As he said, why would I want to go to Washington and be one of 100 senators when I can be governor of Alabama?
Did George Wallace use the N-word?
Oh, yes, absolutely. That would have been pretty common. Lyndon Johnson used the N-word. It was pretty common among figures in Southern politics privately. There are a couple of times when he slipped up and used it publicly as well, but that was not typical at all. And I think much more important than whether you use the N-word. I mean, as I said, Lyndon Johnson did, but often in a different kind of context. I think it was the real problem was the extent to which, in the early 1960s, this man who had been a racial moderate, had been on the board of trustees of Tuskegee University, Black University,
When?
In the early 50s. He told someone that blacks are going to vote in this state, and I want to be on the ground floor. Of course, currents changed. That was by the late 1950s. And I think the tragedy is that someone who had these empathetic feelings for both black and white let himself be caught up both politically and emotionally in the racial currents of the 1960s. And yeah, there was a period of time there it was pretty nasty business, I think.
Right here in Alabama, Florence, Alabama. Tina, you're on the Contenders. The topic is George Wallace. The guest is Dan Carter.
Hello. I enjoyed Mr. Carter's book, and I would like to ask this question about Mr. George Wallace that's deceased. Is his shooter still in prison, and if not, did they gas him, or was he shot?
Arthur Bremer, you're talking about. Yes, Arthur Bremer was the very mentally disturbed young man who shot Governor Wallace. He actually wanted to shoot President Nixon, but he couldn't get close enough to President Nixon. And he eventually was released, and he is now, after many, many years, I can't remember the exact date, but it was the late 90s, maybe early
2007.
2007, it was that long. I remember that I was approached in 99 about a statement for his parole hearing, and he was turned down at that time. So it's only in the last 4 years, after all those years, that he has been released.
Well, just very quickly, let's go back to 1965. George Wallace is governor. He's living here in this governor's mansion in Montgomery, Alabama. And there are Dr. Martin Luther King had been pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which is a block from the Alabama state capitol. And there are marches from Selma to Montgomery. Very quickly, Dr. Carter, why are those marches happening, and what was their effect?
Well, the broader context is the voter registration efforts on the part of African Americans. But there were a whole series of these violent incidents. There was an assault on some demonstrators in Marion, Alabama, in which one young man was killed by a state trooper. And that was really the triggering episode at which they began to talk about some way to demonstrate how angry and frustrated they were. And there was their first attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery, and that was the so-called Pettus Bridge incident, in which turned out to be a disaster in some ways, at least nationally, for Governor Wallace, because there were television cameras there. You know, violence doesn't happen unless it's on television, at least in terms of the great impact that it has. And when John Lewis and others attempted to walk from the Brown's Chapel in Selma across the Pettus Bridge toward Montgomery, they were met by the Alabama state troopers.
Under the orders of Governor Wallace?
Under the orders of Governor Wallace. There's never been clear exactly what those orders were, but he said to stop them. And the state troopers and Major Cloud thought that meant stop them by any means. You also had a bunch of deputies there on horseback who were anxious to do a little head cracking, and that's what happened.
Well, in just a second, we're going to show you some newsreels from 1965 and show you some of the news about those marches from Selma, which is about 100 or so miles, I would say 100 or so miles, less than that, from where we sit now here in Montgomery. We're going to show you some newsreels about that. Then we're going to introduce you to George Wallace's daughter, Peggy Wallace Kennedy. She's inside the mansion, and we'll be joining her in there. Here's the 1965 newsreels.
Selma sprang overnight from an obscure southern town to the front pages of world newspapers. This church was headquarters in the Negro drive for the right to vote, and it was here that Martin Luther King came to lend his support to the campaign. He pointed out that from Selma's 14,000 Negroes, only a few more than 300 had been registered at the polls. When one group set out to march to the Capitol at Montgomery, the procession was broken up violently by state troopers and sheriff's deputies. Then Dr. King led another contingent through the town. This time there is no violence. The 1,000 Negroes and 400 white ministers and civil rights workers reach the end of the bridge where the cordon of troopers stand. They are ordered to turn back. Dr. King confers with the police as the marchers hold their ground. He requests that they be allowed to pray. There are a few minutes of mounting tension. A request to pray is granted, and they kneel in the streets. The long-anticipated Freedom March from Selma to Alabama's capital of Montgomery finally gets underway as Dr. Martin Luther King addresses the crowd at the starting point. Twice before, the marchers had been turned back by state troopers. Now they march under a federal court order and with the protection of federalized National Guard units and regular troops, a total of nearly 3,000 men. For the first day, there are 3,200 marchers in line. Half of the 4-lane Highway 80 is closed to traffic. Later, where it becomes 2 lanes, the marchers had been ordered by the court to reduce their number to 300, a measure designed for their safety. There are a few isolated flare-ups between whites and Negroes, but otherwise the demonstration is peaceful. The first day, the marchers tramp a little over 7 miles. Those who have been assigned to complete the 54-mile walk hope to present a petition to Governor George Wallace.
And you are now looking at a picture of the conclusion of the 3rd Selma to Montgomery March. It finished up on Dexter Avenue, right in front of the state capitol. The Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where Dr. Martin Luther King pastored in the 50s, is located just a block from the state capitol. And just recently, C-SPAN took some video of this same site. This picture was taken just about a month or so ago, and it is about 2 miles north of where we are now. And we are right now at the governor's mansion in Montgomery, Alabama. We're inside the foyer, and we are joined by George Wallace's daughter, Peggy Wallace Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy, we were playing those newsreels from 1965. What are your memories? You were living here in the house at the time.
Yes, I was here, and I was 15 years old, and I can remember what went on and everything. And of course, at that time, I didn't really have an opinion, but I did go to Selma in 2009 and marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with Congressman John Lewis. And so even back in '65, I knew that their cause was just, and I was able to walk across that bridge with my husband and my children.
What was life like here in the governor's mansion?
Well, it's a great house, as you see, and when we moved in, my mother made it a home.
Lurleen?
Yes, she made it a home, and we had a lot of happy times here. We came from a small town. We moved from a small town to the big city, and then, of course, this wonderful, wonderful house that my mother made a home, and it was wonderful. It really was a wonderful place to live.
How aware were you of your father's reputation outside of Alabama, or some of the controversial things that people thought about him?
Well, I really wasn't aware of that part of it. I just was trying to live a normal life, if you can imagine. And my mother was the kind of person that tried to keep us as normal as we could be, normal life and everyday life and school and that kind of thing. So I really wasn't aware of his...
Now, did you, as a child of the governor, did you have a state trooper following you around at all times, or were you pretty free to come and go as you wanted?
We were free to come and go as we wanted, but before I could drive, I had a trooper to take me to school and pick me up. But then after I learned how to drive, then I was on my own.
Now how often was your father around? He had Alabama. He was running Alabama. He was running for president throughout your childhood.
Well, he was in and out, but I grew up in a political family, so it was all right for me to not see him often. So when you don't know anything, any different, then it's okay. And that was all right. My mother was gone a lot too, but that was okay too.
Well, we're talking with Peggy Wallace Kennedy here in the foyer of the governor's mansion in Montgomery, Alabama. And these steps, pretty meaningful to you. There's a couple of different incidences here on these steps. Let's begin with Santa.
I believe this was in 1970, I believe, or 71. It was 71. My father dressed up like Santa Claus and sat on the steps, and I sat on his knee, and that's a picture that I'll always cherish.
What was he like behind closed doors? What was he like as dad?
Well, he was busy. He was always really busy. He ate fast. He walked fast. But he was a wonderful dad when you could get with him, you know. But you had to get that time, the time you had with him, you had to get the quality time. And that was fine, too, because we were used to that.
Something else happened on these steps. What was that? When you got married?
Yes, I got married. And also, when we first moved in here, my brother and I slid down the banisters and into a tour group. So my mother was very, very angry about that. But as I got married, and then I had my wedding reception here.
Well, we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit more about your mother, Lurleen Wallace, or Governor Wallace.
Yes.
How did she get elected governor?
Well, I think the people just loved her.
Were they voting for your dad in surrogate?
I think that probably he thought so. But when she was elected, she certainly let him know who was governor, I can assure you.
And what happened to her, Mrs. Kennedy?
Well, she had cancer and died in May of 1968. She did serve 15 months in office.
After that, between 68 and 71, when your father was reelected, or 70 when he was reelected, moved back in 71, where did you live? What did your father do?
Well, he remarried in 71, and so we moved back in, and then I lived in an apartment in the back of the governor's mansion, and then I married in 73, so I was only here for two more years.
But between 68 and 70, where did you move to?
We had a home in South Montgomery
Montgomery.
my mother and father had bought, yes.
And was he practicing law or running for president?
He was running. He was running. That's what he was doing.
Well, we're going to surprise some folks over here. We do have your husband over here and your son. If we could just turn the camera, Rob, over and just to show them very quickly so we can wave at them over there. And now tell us about your husband.
Well, Mark, we've been married for 38 years, and he has spent 22 years in public service. He retired from the Alabama Supreme Court in 1999. He's now state chairman of the Democratic Party. And my youngest son, Burns, is a history major at the University of Alabama. And our oldest son is serving in Afghanistan right now.
Peggy Wallace Kennedy. Has anyone ever pointed out the irony of a Wallace marrying a Kennedy?
Yes, they have. In fact, when we got engaged, Senator Ted Kennedy wrote my father a letter saying that he was really glad that the Kennedy and the Wallaces could finally get together. And so I have that letter.
Well, Peggy Wallace Kennedy will be joining us a little later in the program. Thank you for spending a few minutes with us. We're going to work our way back out to the set, and we're going to be joined by Joe Reed out here in front of the governor's mansion. He is chairman of the Alabama Democratic Conference, along with our other guest, Wallace biographer Dan Carter, as we take this next call from Houston. Joe, you're on the air. Hi, Joe.
How are you doing today?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. We're talking to Joe, the caller.
Oh,
sorry
okay.
about that. Go ahead, Joe from Houston.
Thank you for taking my call. I have a question. Had George Wallace not been shot in 1972, do you think he would have ran as a third-party candidate? And I have another question regarding in 1976, had he defeated Jimmy Carter in Florida, how far he would have gone in the Democratic 1976 nomination process?
Thank you, Joe. Start with the third party in 72, and then what could have happened in 76.
Well, in 72, of course, he was shot and severely wounded. He did go to the Democratic Convention, but I think it was pretty obvious that his health was such from the injuries he had suffered in being shot that he was not a serious factor in 72. And in 76, Americans have a pretty short lifespan as far as politicians are concerned. That was part of it. The other part was everybody kept talking about the relationship between Governor Wallace's campaign and President Roosevelt, who, of course, campaigned from a wheelchair and was president from a wheelchair. The difference was that in the 1930s there was this gentleman's agreement on the part of the media that he would never be photographed in a wheelchair. And most Americans simply didn't realize how severely crippled he had been by polio. Whereas after 1972, in particular in 1976, every single moment the cameras were on. There were a couple of incidents, one in which he was dropped, and it re-emphasized the fact that he was in a wheelchair. And it wasn't even apart from that. One of the things that made Governor Wallace so effective was this feisty bantam rooster kind of bravado that he had. He didn't walk across the stage. He strutted across the stage, often with his fist in the old boxing. He was a boxing champion as a young man. And in a wheelchair, it was not possible to do that.
Now we want to introduce you to Dr. Joe Reed, who is chairman of the Alabama Democratic Conference. Yes. He also works with the Alabama Education Association. Yes. Dr. Reed, what's your first memory of George Wallace?
The first memory I had of George Wallace was really back in 1958. I had just come from Korea, and George Wallace was running for governor. He was a candidate for governor at that time because John Patterson had pretty much defeated him. It was 58 when I first heard of him. That's when I first heard of George Wallace, back at that time.
And do you remember what the memory is?
He was very vocal, and at that time, he didn't have any particular claim, anything any other Southern politician had at that time. But all were, most times, running on platforms against the U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1954. They were all saying they were going to maintain segregation. They were all claiming that they could do what the law insisted that they would do. They all claimed they could get around the law. So at that particular time, he was not much different than the rest of them.
What was your life like in Alabama in 1958?
Like most other black folk in the South, and to some extent in this country. For example, segregation was the least the law for practical purposes, even though the Supreme Court had ruled in Brown versus the Board of Education. But for all practical purposes, Alabama was still arguing and fighting that particular issue. We were all mindful of Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrat ticket in 48, and blacks were becoming more and more sensitized to that. The Montgomery bus boycott had occurred, and blacks had achieved a great victory there. So things were looking up.
And were you able to vote in 1958?
1958, yes, I was able to vote in 58. I was from Conecuh County. That's a small county between Montgomery and Mobile. Blacks were not a threat to whites politically in Conecuh County. And plus the fact veterans didn't have a problem getting registered to vote in 58 in Conecuh County because they were not a threat. Also, there was a sheriff there whose idea was named John Brock. John Brock took on the establishment in Conecuh County, and John Brock went out and got blacks to help blacks to get registered to vote before 58, because John Brown died in 56, but before 58, there was efforts made to get blacks registered to vote, because again, blacks did not constitute a threat. The votes were more captive votes than anything else. So that's, in that particular time, but being a veteran, that was not a major problem, getting registered to vote.
Dr. Reed, what do you do with the Alabama Education Association?
I'm the Associate Executive Secretary of the Alabama Education Association.
Longtime teacher.
It's the teachers union. And of course, it's our professional organization. And I've been privileged to serve that organization since 1964, when the Black and White Association merged in '69. I came on with the Black Association in 1964, the Alabama State Teachers Association. There were some 11 southern states had dual associations in the South, stretching from Virginia to Texas. So I came on as executive secretary at that time. So, and then in 1969 we merged, and I've been there for 47 years.
Well, it was in 1963, and Dan Carter, you've referred to this a couple of times, the schoolhouse stand. Let's see this video of George Wallace, followed by President Kennedy.
The unwelcomed, unwanted, unwarranted, and force-induced intrusion upon the campus of the University of Alabama, today of the might of the central government, offers frightful example of the oppression of the rights, privileges, and sovereignty of this state by officers of the federal government.
This afternoon, following a series of threats and defiant statements, the presence of Alabama National Guardsmen was required on the University of Alabama to carry out the final and unequivocal order of the United States District Court of the Northern District of Alabama. That order called for the admission of 2 clearly qualified young Alabama residents who happened to have been born Negro.
Dr. Reed, what do you remember about that incident in 1963?
We were just glad to see President Kennedy come on and make Wallace behave. It was very simple. We always thought he was going to lose. He had lost some races before that time, particularly in 1959 and 60, when he had a confrontation with Judge Franklin Johnson over some voter registrars and voter registration records. See, a lot of folks forget the fact there was a civil rights bill in 1957, civil rights bill. That particular civil rights bill, which was came under President Eisenhower, allowed the president to appoint a commission to come in and investigate voter discrimination. And because blacks in Tuskegee, Alabama, and particularly in Barber County and other places, could not get registered to vote, this commission came in and did its investigation. In the course of that, George Wallace refused to turn some records over to them. They went into the United States Middle District Court, where Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr. was the presiding judge, and Judge Johnson ordered the records to be turned over to the Civil Rights Commission so that they could complete their investigation. So that being the case, we found that that was one of the earlier times where George Wallace also misled the voters again in Alabama, thinking he could do things he couldn't do.
Carrie in Parkersburg, West Virginia, you're on the Contenders. The topic is George Wallace. We're live from Montgomery, Alabama.
Yes, first of all, I want to thank C-SPAN for showing us the exquisite governor's mansion. And then I'd like to know about Wallace's relationship with J. Edgar Hoover. Since Wallace was so contentious and inflammatory, how was Wallace monitored, and did Wallace have an opinion of Hoover? Thank you.
Dan Carter, about his relationship with J. Edgar Hoover and whether or not George Wallace was monitored.
No, not really. I mean, not in the sense that subversives were. They kept a complete file on Governor Wallace, as Herbert Hoover did on virtually anybody. And it's interesting because although Governor Wallace constantly praised Mr. Hoover and relied upon him, particularly for information about the so-called links between civil rights activists and communists, Hoover was always leery of Wallace, in part because I don't think he could control him. And so as a result, Hoover always told his men to keep a kind of hands-off. And as a result, there was a kind of distant relationship between the two of them.
Dan Carter is the author of this book, The Politics of Rage, about George Wallace. What's his picture on the cover of the book?
That is from the inaugural address in 1963.
January 14, 1963.
That's right.
Steps of the state capitol, 2 miles from where we are now. Randall in Stockton, California, good evening.
How you doing? The question I need to ask is, as the son of a civil rights leader who came across that Selma Bridge in 1963, I want to know why in the world wasn't he allowed to come across? I know I heard things from my father, but I need to get the understanding as a grown person now, is why Governor Wallace wouldn't let the rest of us come across the bridge. And then when we did come across the bridge, why were we attacked? What kind of threat did we propose upon this nationality? So the bottom line is, I want to know, was Governor Wallace and and both Congress, were they in cahoots with each other to conspire for us not to come across the bridge? So I want to know the answer to that.
Joe Reed?
I really didn't get his full question.
Dan Carter, did you hear his question?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
The real reason was that if the marchers had crossed the Pettus Bridge, regardless of with television cameras, and there were all these television cameras set up there, it would have been a face-saving loss for Governor Wallace. And he had made it clear that he was not going to allow it. He told Al Lingo, who was the head of the state troopers, and he also told Colonel McLeod, Major Cloud, who was in charge of the troopers at the time, that they were not under any circumstances to be allowed to march, and they took them very seriously. At that point, they were ready to go with tear gas, horses, mounted men from a posse, and they didn't.
Well, I think that Governor Wallace was more concerned at that time about showing his fellow travelers, his supporters, his friends, that he was going to make the black folks behave. I'm going to stop them at all costs. If he had just allowed the march to continue, a lot of things probably would not have happened, including the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. I think that when NBC News, I remember that one, I'm sure other news stations carried it too, showed that how those ladies were being beaten in Selma. And also a couple of other things happened during that same time when those 2 white ministers were killed, Reverend Reeb and James Reeb and forget the other's name. But at any rate, when all that happened, and when the white clergy, the white clergy also got involved in this, and they started demanding that something happens, and they started coming into Alabama. And then when the white clergy got upset, the White House got even more upset. And so those things, in my opinion, were the major factors also in terms of responding to Wallace's resistance to the march. But if he had just left it alone, it probably would have turned out differently, much differently.
Joe Reed, what was your level of activity in the civil rights movement of the 60s?
My level of activity in the civil rights movement of the 60s, I was not at the bridge. This was in 1965. I was with the Alabama State Teachers Association. We supported the movement, provided resources for the movement. We actually involved, in fact, our local chapter in Selma, Alabama, led by Reverend Reese, was one of the leaders in the Selma to Montgomery march. He and Andrew Durgan. In fact, they came to the Alabama State Teachers Association, and we went to Washington to solicit help from the National Education Association to get involved in protecting and ensuring that our members got the right to vote. So we were deeply involved in that.
Well, we just showed you the clip from 1963, the schoolhouse incident. Here's George Wallace in 1967 talking about that incident and a little bit on the Newark riots that were occurring.
As I have said, we are further obligated to oppose the enemies of freedom wherever we find them. A little over 3 years ago, we stood at the University of Alabama We went there for the purpose of opposing the enemies of freedom and to use that stand as a national forum to warn the people of this nation that if men in high places in Washington can break the law of our Constitution, then every revolutionary, every thug who can assemble a mob will feel that they too can break the law. We warned of the coming lawlessness that would sweep our nation, adversely affecting all citizens.
The worst race riots since those 2 years ago in the Watts section of Los Angeles rocked New Jersey's largest city, Newark, for 5 consecutive days and nights. At least 24 persons are killed, more than 1,800 wounded, some 1,400 arrested. Despite patrolling by city and state police, millions of dollars in property damage is done. Looters wreck and clean out scores of shops in the Negro Ghetto District. The fury of the mob makes any official-looking vehicle a target. 2 days after its beginning, police are augmented by National Guardsmen. Snipers make the streets a battlefield. Governor Hughes terms the rioting open rebellion, just like wartime. Sniper fire from open windows kills 2 policemen, a fire captain shot in the back while answering a false alarm, and several bystanders. Scores of police, troopers, guardsmen, and civilians are wounded. Officials said the snipers, some believed not to be Newark residents, used guns stolen from a local rifle factory. Even machine guns were used. Because of widespread looting, 8 emergency food centers are set up to supply milk, bread, and cereal to besieged and terrorized residents. Looters arrested by National Guardsmen are dealt with swiftly. A 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew is clamped on fully 1/3 of Newark. While Newark struggles to restore peace and order, the racial bitterness spreads to 4 nearby suburban towns, where a policeman is beaten to death, guns are stolen, looting and violence are reported. New Jersey, a state under siege.
And back live here in Montgomery, Alabama. Dan Carter, the race riots of the 67-68 time period, what effect did they have on George Wallace's campaigns for governor and the national conversation?
Listening to that clip, I think you can get some idea what effect that it had. Much of it is very hyperbolic. We now know that a lot of the claims that were made during the race riots, they were extraordinarily serious. But all the talk about snipers and so on has been pretty much disproved. There was a lot of shooting, a lot of violence, but that even the music, everything about it gives the impression that the nation is under siege. And although there was absolutely no connection between the race riots, which had to do with poverty, which I think had to do with poverty, had to do with the conditions in the inner cities, in the minds of many Americans, the civil rights movement and the riots of the 1960s are all blended together. Both of them are rebellions against authority. And the distinction of one, which is the civil rights movement, is going to be nonviolent. It's going to rely upon nonviolence. And the other, this kind of spasm of outburst of violence, quite different. They're both black, and the connection is there.
Joe Reed, what do you remember about April 4th, 1968, the assassination?
Dr. King was shot. I remember I was visiting, really, Dr. Levi Watkins' office, president of Alabama State University. When I walked in his office in Montgomery, and I walked in his office, he said, Dr. King has been shot. Now that's what I remember. That you may ask me a question a little earlier, a while ago, some other things in this, about the civil rights movement. I was also involved in the sit-in movement. That's another effort on the part of this whole growing resistance on the part of black folks and the unwillingness to continue to accept segregation. You had the Montgomery bus boycott, you had the sit-in movement, you had the freedom rides, you had all of these things collectively where blacks were demanding it now. And of course, with the riots taking place in certain places, which of course Dr. King always condemned, there were those who saw this as a threat to white well-being.
Joe Reed, did you ever meet George Wallace?
Oh yes, I met him many, many times. I met him. I don't remember the first time I met Governor Wallace. I really don't. But I do remember him speaking to the Alabama Education Association. I think that may have been the first time that I shook his hand because he had signed a bill.
This is in the 70s?
Yes, this was probably in the 70s when we did that.
Right.
But I was always very critical of Governor Wallace. In fact, he said to me one time, he said, "Joe, so you always been critical of me, but you were never nasty to me," because we had a bill we was trying to get him to sign, and that bill had to do with us signing deputy registrars to register people to vote anytime. And the boards of registrars across the state of Alabama were against it. And of course, we went to him and asked him to sign the bill. And he said, "Well, yeah, Joe, you criticized me, but you were never nasty," and went on and signed the bill. So I said all that to say, yes, many times we talked. In this last 4 years, we talked even more.
And we'll get into that a little later in our Contenders program. Son in Chase City, Virginia, thanks for holding. You're on C-SPAN.
Hi, thank you very much. I just wonder if Mr. Carter could comment on how the racial politics of rage in the 1950s and 1960s may have morphed into the current hard right stance of the Tea Party and the other Republican candidates on issues like gay marriage and illegal immigration, and if these might not be actually surrogate issues for people whose racial attitudes really haven't changed, but it's just no longer in fashion to speak publicly about that.
Dan Carter.
Wow, that's really a tough one, to draw the direct connection. We certainly don't have the same kind of language about race that we once had, and we can scoff all we want to about political correctness. The fact is that it's politically incorrect to engage in any kind of racist language. But we do have this long tradition in the United States, in this very cantankerous democracy at times, of selecting scapegoats, and particularly groups that seem to represent a violation of what the cultural norms are that are so profoundly felt. And whether it's the issue of prayer in the schools, or whether it's the issue of gay marriage, and in economic hard times, whether it's the issue of the immigrants and so-called job challenges that is threatening the jobs of Americans. Yeah, there is a connection in the sense that we want an enemy. And that enemy may be African Americans at some point, it may be other groups, but unfortunately it's one of the darker sides of American history.
George Wallace ran for president in 1964. In 1968, in that year, he captured 5 states and 46 electoral votes. He also ran in 72 and 76. Next call, Tampa Bay, Florida. Hi, Mike. Mike, Tampa Bay, please go ahead.
Yes,
okay, we're going to move on.
Yes, I've had a
Mike,
really
go ahead,
cathartic
please.
experience tonight as a young American watching these old clips of being played. It really gives me hope to see how the two divergent cultures have come together in the clips, and it gives me great sense of hope to see how our political differences might be able to be bridged today.
Joe Reed, have politics changed in Alabama?
Yes, politics in Alabama has changed. I think one thing we have to keep in mind, though, racism, I don't think, as Martin King called the good thinking and the whites of goodwill in this country, realize yet the depth of racism. And the gentleman who asked the question earlier, I think all of these things are still part of the dyed in the wool racism that still exists to this day, not only in Alabama but in other states in this country. So I think that's part of it. Now, the question that the gentleman raised there about, I missed that part.
Well, he was talking about how politics have changed, and that leads me to ask you, what is the Alabama Democratic Conference? Well, the Alabama Democratic Conference was founded in 1960 for the purpose of helping John F. Kennedy. Blacks were shut out of the Democratic Party in Alabama at that time because, we had got Smith versus Allwright back in the mid-40s, and so we were still struggling and hadn't gotten the right to
vote until in the mid-60s. So blacks were struggling. Other Arthur Shores and other leaders, C.G. Gamillion versus Lightfoot and others, really were trying to get a voice in the Democratic Party. So the Alabama Democratic Conference was set up for that purpose. And then as time moved on, the Alabama Democratic Conference set out to do two things fundamentally. And that was to get white political leaders' attention. That was one of the things that they said, and also to unify the black vote so we could, what we call, make the white politicians behave. It was that kind of thing that we were working on. So that's what the Alabama Democratic Conference was about and still about to this day.
1968 was George Wallace's best run for governor. Here's for president. Here is part of his announcement.
But one of the issues confronting the people is the breakdown of law and order. And both national parties are apologizing today and saying that it comes about as a result of welfare payments, job opportunities, education, etc. And the average man on the street in this country knows that it comes about because of activists, militants, revolutionaries, anarchists, and communists. And if I were the president, I'd give my strong moral support to the local police officers of this country and local law enforcement, and say you enforce the law. And I can tell you that if I were the president of the United States, you could walk on the streets in any section of Washington, D.C. at any time, and I would make that possible if I had to bring 30,000 troops to Washington and put one every 30 feet with a 2-foot bayonet on the end of a rifle. We're going to make it safe for all the citizens of Washington, D.C., because it's a sad commentary that in the nation's capital you are fearful of walking out of this hotel. And this is not race I'm talking about, and every time I mention this, they say this has racial overtones. When has it come to have racial overtones in this country to stand for law and order? But newsmen have indicated so long that the people in our state who have defended the right of the state to determine the policies of their local school systems believe in separation. That is, racial separation. We have had more mingling and association of the races in Alabama than I would say in any large industrial state above the Mason and Dixon line. Now, when you talk about segregation, we have supported in the past a separate school system. But as far as working and mingling and living close together, we have done more of that than the people of any other region of the country. And one reason that we've had more peace in our region has been that people of all races are needed and wanted in Alabama. And so I still stand for the right of the people of Alabama through their elected representatives to determine the policies of their school system.
Joe Reed, want to get your reaction to Governor Wallace speaking in 1968.
Well, if he's talking about desegregating public education, it's not owed to his efforts. It's because we had Judge Frank M. Johnson in Montgomery, Alabama, who was really the architect, who did more than anybody else in my opinion. Then, of course, we had that Lee versus Macon decision, which counted for 100 school systems in one fell swoop. We desegregated public education. So it cannot be attributed to anything Governor Wallace did. It's attributed to the fact that the federal government and black leaders, the NAACP and other organizations went out and fought, marched, and everything else to desegregate public education in this state.
Dan Carter, when you hear the words law and order, welfare, militants, are those code words?
Yes, absolutely. This is, they don't like this here, but that's, no, the fact is that once television plays such a critical role in the political process, you're aware of the fact that every word you're saying is being captured on film or whatever, and you have to be careful. And as the sense of, as I said, whatever you want to call it, political correctness, then you have to be careful about how you say it. So you learn a different language, and it's a language in which you, without ever referring specifically to race, you talk about race. And nobody was better at it than Governor Wallace. I mean, whenever he wanted to complain about the federal government enforcing housing non-discrimination, he didn't talk about them making African Americans live close to you. He talked about blue-eyed Chinamen, that they were going to keep them from, make them come into your neighborhood. And everybody knew, of course, exactly what he was talking about.
1968, Richard Nixon, 301 electoral votes. Hubert Humphrey, 191 electoral votes. Hubert Humphrey won 13 states plus D.C., and George Wallace won nearly 10 million votes, 5 states, 46 electoral votes. Dan Carter, who won the black vote in 1968?
It was Hubert Humphrey.
Do you remember who you voted for?
Fact,
Did you vote for Hubert Humphrey in 1968?
Not only that, I was Hubert Humphrey's national committee. I was a co-chair for the National Committee of Educators to support Hubert Humphrey. So I was a strong Hubert Humphrey person. And that was the first time in 1968 that blacks went to the Democratic National Convention. And it turned out that I was privileged and lucky enough to go because Chairman Bob Vance had arranged that, and so had Arthur
That was quite a wild convention, wasn't it?
Yes, that was a convention in 1968. So, yes, I was a pro-Humphrey person. I knew him personally. So, yes, we achieved what we wanted to achieve to get Humphrey nominated, but we didn't achieve what we wanted to get him elected.
We are out in front of the governor's mansion in Montgomery, Alabama, where George Wallace lived for 20% of his life. 16 years he lived here, 2 miles south of downtown Montgomery. This is the Contenders, our 12th week. We have 2 more weeks after this. Our next call comes from Jackson, Mississippi. Jordan, you're on C-SPAN. Hi.
Yes, sir. I have a comment and a question. My comment is I began my interest in politics when I was 10 years old, working for the American Independent Party in Pennsylvania as a Wallace volunteer. And even though he didn't have a great deal of support in Pennsylvania, he certainly had a strong base of support in the Philadelphia area. My question for Dr. Carter is, what was his relationship as far as Richard Nixon? Did he? I know that the Alabama Republicans backed him during the civil rights crisis. Pretty much, Congressman Bill Dickinson of Opelika was a strong Wallace supporter, and he was one of the early, I think, Goldwater Republicans in Alabama. And I was just wondering, what did Wallace think of Richard Nixon, and did he actually ever endorse Richard Nixon for president?
Dan Carter.
No, he didn't think much of Richard Nixon, and particularly after 1968, because in 1970, when Governor Wallace was running, his wife had died, of course, in office. Albert Brewer became governor, then was going to run against former Governor Wallace. Richard Nixon put $400,000 in secret cash into the Brewer campaign, and it didn't stay a secret all that long. And moreover, Governor Wallace always suspected that Richard Nixon was trying to destroy him, which he was, because Nixon saw Wallace as his greatest threat in 1972. So he made every effort that he could, and certainly Governor Wallace was aware of that.
And Dan Carter, of rage, the 1972 campaign, George Wallace started strong, correct, before he was shot?
Oh, absolutely. As I said, he got more votes by the end of the day he was shot. He had more votes than any other Democratic candidate at the time. I don't think he would have, even then, would have gotten the nomination, but it was a tremendous problem for the Democratic Party.
After he was shot in 1972, Richard Nixon went to see him, correct?
That's correct. That's right.
Who else went to see him?
Oh, just about everybody. Hubert Humphrey went to see him. George McGovern went to see him.
Ethel Kennedy?
Ethel Kennedy went to see him. They were all, and in her case, I think it was a sense of compassion after what had happened. In other cases, it was the politics of it. They realized that they would like to have his support. Nixon did more than go to see him, though. He also really manipulated the shooting of Governor Wallace by trying to trying to link the man who had shot him to George McGovern.
Joe Reed, do you remember when George Wallace was shot?
Yes, I remember that vividly. I learned it at my office that day. And of course, you know, regardless of whether you like a person or differ with them, you don't want anybody shot or hurt. And of course, my sympathy went out to the Wallace family as well as went out to everybody else. It was just one thing you didn't want to happen. But I do remember it very well. And of course, I went to the Democratic Convention in 1972 where George Wallace was, and he was trying to make his way, but as has been said earlier, when he was shot and paralyzed, that pretty much ended his political career as a presidential candidate. On the other hand, he continued to run for office and hold office in Alabama as governor. And of course, I think too, after that shooting, and after he was paralyzed for so long, you may be going to get to that later on, I think that's where he really got his, I call it the conversion, because, and I'll hold that for a little, maybe you can.
Right, we will get into that. Governor Wallace served as governor of Alabama 1963 to 1967, 1971 to 1979, and finally from 1983 to 1987. Dan Carter, George Wallace went ahead and ran in the 1976 campaign. How long did that last?
Well, he made it through several of the early primaries. The problem was not only the difficulty of campaigning from a wheelchair, but there was another Southerner in the campaign. That was Jimmy Carter.
That's right.
And Carter didn't have some of the baggage that Governor Wallace had. Moreover, he was running in the aftermath of Watergate. And as this is when religion really gets into the campaigning, and he ran as this highly moral person who was going to restore moral integrity to the White House. I'll never lie to you, Jimmy Carter. And in so many different ways, with his own progressive record as governor of Georgia, he proved a better candidate than Governor Wallace. And the big example was that big primary in Florida, where Governor Wallace lost to Jimmy Carter, and that pretty much finished him.
Pensacola, Florida. Terry, thanks for holding. You're on the Contenders. George Wallace is a topic this week.
Yes, sir. I remember as a 10-year-old boy when George Wallace got shot. It was a very devastating day that day to me as a youngster. And my question is, when Governor Wallace was running for president there in the 70s, who was his endorsements? You know, how these presidential people have their money backers, and how did he raise his money to run for office? And then the other question I have, I know he has a son that's in political offices. Well, does he have any endeavors of running for governor at all? And I'll listen to you.
The money, I will say, there was some quote big money, but by and large, George Wallace, you can like him or dislike him, but he was an extraordinarily successful fundraiser of small contributions. He got millions of dollars from people in small $10, $25, $50. He was never really backed by the big money individuals. And I'll let Dr. Reed talk about George Wallace Jr. there.
Who is George Wallace IV or George Wallace Jr.?
Yes, he ran for state treasurer.
He's his son, right?
He's his son. And he ran for state treasurer twice and got elected. In fact, the Alabama Democratic Conference endorsed him, endorsed the son. And of course, he later on switched to the Republican Party, and we opposed him. But overall, he was a nice fellow.
And he's currently a Republican.
Yeah, he's
correct?
currently a Republican. And that.
And Peggy Wallace Kennedy is honorary chairperson of the Democratic Party. Is that correct? Here in, I think that's what she told us earlier, that she's honorary chair.
She probably, because her husband is chair of the Democratic Party of the state of Alabama. And of course, he's done a good job. Got an uphill fight like all of us Democrats have in the state of Alabama now. But the bottom line is that George Wallace Jr. did run for the state treasurer. In fact, the day we endorsed him, George Wallace Sr. came to the Alabama Democratic Conference convention. And of course, The rest is history.
Well, we want to show you one more ad from our one more piece of video from 1968. This is an ad that George Wallace was running.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Follow as your children are bused across town.
As president, I shall, within the law, turn back the absolute control of the public school systems to the people of the respective states.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Open a little business and see what might happen.
As president, I will stand up for your local police and firemen in protecting your safety and property.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Watch your hard-earned tax dollars sail away to anti-American countries.
As president, I will halt the giveaway of your American dollars and products to those nations that aid our enemies.
Wallace has the courage to stand up for America. Give him your support.
And our next call comes from Tony in Pleasantville, New York. Tony, you're on the Contenders. Hi.
Yes, Peter. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. I was 21 years old in 1968, just out of the Navy, and looking back, I'm 65 now, but over the years I supported George Wallace, Ross Perot, Ralph Nader, and currently a Ron Paul supporter. I went to a rally in 1968 in Madison Square Garden, George Wallace and his vice presidential candidate, Curtis LeMay. 21-minute standing ovation by a sellout crowd. And during the presentation, there were some hecklers, and way up in the far-reaching seats, about 6 or 7 of them. You could see the lights of the cameras. When the event was over, the local news, we only had 3 channels then in those days, the only thing they reported was the hecklers that were heckling George Wallace. Outside Madison Square Garden were about 50 mounted police and motorcyclemen expecting riots. It was very, very peaceful. What I've learned at this rally and over the ensuing years is how unfairly the media treats third-party candidates. C-SPAN wasn't around in 1968, but if C-SPAN was around in 68, George Wallace would have done even better. And I think in 72, if he wasn't shot, he had a good shot at winning.
All right, Tony, let's leave it there. Dan Carter, that was, of course, the American Independent Party that George Wallace was running on, but the role of the media in 1968.
Well, first, congratulations. You're the first person I've actually ever talked to, even over television, who was at that rally, which was a pretty remarkable rally. There is a lot of film footage from it, which we were able to use in a documentary we did on Governor Wallace. And although I think you're right, most of the time the media does tend to dismiss third-party candidates. Part of it is they like confrontation. And there actually were about 20, I've looked at the film very closely, about 20 demonstrators shouting Sieg Heil and giving the Hitler salute and with a swastika. Well, that's colorful news, and that's often what news media like. Whereas the speeches themselves, they obviously were going to give a 21-minute ovation, which you're exactly right. He received a 20-minute ovation.
Dr. Reed, did you want to add something?
Not to that.
Okay, it looked like you were about to add something. We'll move on then to our next call from Surf City, North Carolina. John, good evening.
Hey, I just had a question about George Wallace's pre-legislative activity that before he got involved with the legislature of Alabama, wasn't he the lawyer for some of the people that were involved in the assassination of Attorney General John Patterson and some of the Phoenix City gambling interests and things of that nature?
He would know better. No,
does that ring any bells
no,
here?
That doesn't ring any bells at all. There, that's
Dr. Reed, if George Wallace were alive today, would he be a Republican in Alabama or a Democrat?
I think he would still be a Democrat. I really do. I think that he would just. I don't think he liked the Republicans. And out of all his running, he's always a Democrat in Alabama, even he was running other places. He's a Democrat in Alabama. And so I think he would have stayed a Democrat. I don't think he would have changed.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's clear that his heart, in some ways, with the policies of the Democratic Party, particularly the economic policies of the Democratic Party. On the other hand, he was pretty hostile toward the national government and its activities, and it's possible that may have led him. Certainly, if he was running for office in Alabama, lived a long time, he'd be running as a Republican, because that's the way you're going to get elected.
Joe Reed, George Wallace was elected in 1970 and in 1974 to the gubernatorial office here in Alabama. He ran for president in 72 and 76, and in 82 he said, "I've been wrong about the race issue."
Yeah.
What happened?
I think that after he was shot, I think George Wallace's entire political career, to about the last few years, was based, embedded, sanctioned, guided by race, period. I don't think he lost the race to John Patterson because he was, the N-word was used too much. I don't think that. I think John Patterson would have defeated George Wallace anyway for one reason, and that was John Patterson's daddy
This
had
is
been
1958.
shot. Yes, for trying to clean up Phoenix City. And I think that Governor Wallace was not going to beat him either way. I think that was, John Patterson was a prosecutor, and he knew how to go after things. So I don't think Governor Wallace would
back to 1982.
But back to 1982. Your question was whether or not,
George Wallace said he was wrong about the race issue.
And I think he meant that. I think he meant it because he felt he had been punished. I think he felt that you've been in a wheelchair over a quarter century, and if you are a Christian, and he said he was, you'd have to look back and say, why am I here? Why am I going through this? So I really believe that he went through this conversion. George Wallace was one of the few politicians who would run on segregation platform that publicly repudiated segregation and said, I was wrong.
So in 1982, after that, did you vote for him for governor?
I voted for the straight Democratic ticket, straight out.
So
now,
George Wallace was on that ticket?
He was on that ticket. The Alabama Democratic Conference did not endorse George Wallace. The paper reported we did not. We supported George McMillan. George McMillan lost. When George McMillan lost in the primary, Wallace was on the train anyway. There were blacks running for a county commission, blacks running for the legislature, blacks running for everything. And as always, we told blacks to vote straight Democratic ticket because we didn't even there was no Republican out there. Emory Farmer was running as the Republican opponent, and I can tell you right now, someone raised a question. I'll be trying to be brief with this. If somebody raised a question, they said, well, both of them are racist. I said, they may be. I said, so one is a rising sun and one is a setting sun. And so that's what happened on it. But the Alabama Democratic Conference never endorsed Wallace.
We are out in front of the governor's mansion in Montgomery, Alabama, where George Wallace lived for 16 years. Don in Claremont, California. Good evening. You're on C-SPAN's Contenders program. Peter,
thank you. It's a great honor. I love the way you handled the Toni Morrison quote on Envy of the World. That was priceless. I went in the Marine Corps in 1970, left Erie, Pennsylvania, got down to the South, and I was amazed how that the Southerners were treating, everybody. And I saw the movie Help, which I thought was absolutely a picture shot of what the South was like, and the way that the blacks were subjugated to, it's phenomenal. Terrific movie. Another movie that really has to be mentioned is Waiting for Superman. And you hear that about how the unions, the teacher unions, are giving this idea of what's happening. I teach out here as a substitute teacher in California, and I try to bring up what the Democrats were in control of the South that caused all this. I mean, the deaths in Mississippi, the complete destruction of society. I look at Detroit, I look all over, and there sits Joe Reed, and I'd like to ask how much of his retirement salary after 47 years as a teacher, and you look at what the teachers' unions has done to this country and how, excuse me, They don't do one thing.
Don, you're getting a little off topic. We appreciate your call, and we'll get an answer for you very quickly. Speak about the Education Association and respond to his comment, but very quickly.
Well, the Alabama Education Association, as it exists now, is a combination of the black and white teachers coming together back in 1969. So for 42 years, we have been merged. We've had various successes. We have a lot of successes. Some of those being bringing in the maids and the janitors into our organization, protecting tenure, defending our members' rights in court. And all, we suffered some setbacks in the last election, but we're still fighting for the rights of teachers. And Alabama is considered one of the most effective associations, the AEA, in the country.
Well, I can tell you one thing. If George Wallace was still active in politics, he wouldn't be attacking the teachers or the teachers union.
No.
He was, for one thing, politically, he saw them as important. But I think it's a reflection of how there are many similarities between the kind of conservatism that George Wallace helped create and the way it's become today, in which suddenly teachers who really aren't paid that much, who really don't get vast pensions, suddenly become another one of the scapegoats of society. Governor Wallace wouldn't have done that.
That caller also mentioned the movie The Help, and I want to ask you both, did you see the movie The Help?
Yes.
Did you see the movie The Help? Okay.
Yeah, I did.
What was your impression of it?
Well, it was, I read the book, and
You're from the South.
From the South. It's a recreation of what it was like in this world in which black and white, particularly middle class, upper middle class white Southerners, often had connections to blacks, but it was always in this subordinate position as the help. And I think the film, it's been criticized by some, but I think it does a good job of explaining the unfairness of that relationship.
The city of Montgomery, Alabama is full of history. The Jefferson Davis White House from the Confederacy is here. Rosa Parks began her bus boycott here as well. Dr. Martin Luther King preached at the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, which is 1 block from the state capitol, where George Wallace announced on January 14th, 1963, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. It's laid out. You can see a lot of these different exhibits here in the city as well. Next call for our two guests, Dan Carter and Joe Reed, comes from Poughkeepsie, New York. Nick, you're on the Contenders.
Oh, she told you not to do it. Oh, they just came down.
Nick, you're on the Contenders. Okay, we're going to move on from Nick. We'll get rid of Nick, and we will move south to Kennesaw, Georgia. John, you're on the Contenders. Please go ahead with your question about George Wallace.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Carter. Getting back to the 72 election and his choice of Curtis LeMay as his running mate, I was just curious as to what motivated him to make that selection, what their relationship was. Thank you very much.
And that was in '68, right? Correct?
Right.
Okay.
Well, I mean, he thought that General LeMay would bring in a lot of veterans voters. And remember now, in the 1960s, there were still a huge number of vets from World War II and from Korea and even Vietnam. And he thought putting a respectable general like LeMay on the ticket would help him draw a lot of these voters in, and it would also draw in the hardliners who wanted to press on the war in Vietnam, even though Governor Wallace was sometimes a little ambivalent. I think that was the main reason. It turned out to be a disaster, but that's another story.
And in '72 and '76, he didn't get close enough to pick a vice presidential candidate. Yes, sir.
Well, we also considered the governor of Kentucky,
right.
I think Happy Chandler, and some of his folk opposed Chandler because Chandler had welcomed, at least went along with bringing Jackie Robinson into baseball, because Chandler was the commissioner of baseball. So when Branch Rickey brought Jackie Robinson in, Chandler was with it. And some of Wallace's supporters did not want Chandler on the ticket because of that.
Right.
He was out of Kentucky, of course.
Yeah.
Joe Reed, do you remember your last conversation with George Wallace?
I was trying to
think about that.
Okay.
As we go back, we want to reintroduce George Wallace's daughter, Peggy Wallace Kennedy, who's joining us from inside the mansion. Mrs. Kennedy, you've been listening to our conversation for the last hour and a half. What have you heard?
Well, I've heard a lot about my father.
We're not able to hear Peggy Wallace Kennedy at this moment, but we will in just a minute. As Mrs. Kennedy?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Now we can hear you.
Well, I've heard a lot about my father, and I've enjoyed reminiscing a little bit. My father, to me, in my heart, he was not a racist. He was a politician, and he is the man that I want to remember, and that I want my children to remember, is that this is a man that in his later years he reached out for forgiveness, and he received that forgiveness.
Do you think that he did have some racist tendencies in the 60s?
In my heart, I don't think that. I think he was just a politician, and that does not make it right, what he did. So, like I said, that the man I want to remember is the one that reached out for forgiveness and received that forgiveness.
Mrs. Kennedy, can you tell us about the day your father was shot? Where were you, etc.?
Yes, I was in college. I attended Troy University, and I was sitting in a classroom, and I remember looking up at the clock. I was in the classroom alone waiting for a class to start, and just remember looking at that particular time. And then when the class was over, one of my friends came to me, and she felt like that maybe I had already heard that my father had been shot and that he was okay. But she said, "Well, your father's okay. He's been shot, so he must be okay." And I said, "Well, no, I didn't know that." So I was brought here to the mansion and then flown straight to Maryland.
Now, we just want to be clear, because we were talking about you a little bit earlier here. You are the honorary chair of the Alabama Democratic Party, correct?
No, my husband is the chairman of the Alabama Democratic Party. I just sort of stand by him and help him when I can, and I do make some speeches at Alabama Democratic Party functions.
And your brother is now a Republican, correct?
Yes, he is, but I still love him very much.
All right, the same question to you that we asked Dr. Reed and Dr. Carter. If your father were alive today, would he be a Democrat or a Republican?
I think he'd be a Democrat.
And if your father were alive today, who would he have voted for in 2008?
Well, I think he possibly could have voted for President Obama. I know that he would have been proud that I endorsed President Obama, and I think he would have been very proud that I marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 2009.
With John Lewis?
Absolutely, with Congressman John Lewis.
Right. And Peggy Wallace Kennedy wrote a piece for CNN the day after the election, November 3rd, 2008. If you're interested, you can go to CNN and read it. It's about her visiting her father's grave and having an Obama bumper sticker on her car. Albany, Georgia. Tim, you're on the Contenders. George Wallace is the topic.
Hello?
Hi, Tim. Albany, Georgia. Go ahead.
Yes, just a couple of things real quick. I know my time is limited. Number one, Selma is only about 40 or 50 miles from Montgomery. I grew up in Selma at the time of the march. My question is for Mr. Carter. At the time of the march, rumors were running rampant. A woman by the name of Viola Luzo, I believe I have my pronunciation correct, was giving marchers a ride back in her car when she was ambushed. And it was rumored for many, many years that one of the marchers she was giving a ride was an undercover FBI agent. I wondered, had he ever heard of this rumor? Thank you very much.
It wasn't her passenger. It was one of the individuals in the car that did the shooting was an undercover agent. And it was his testimony that made it possible for the immediate arrest of the people who did the shooting, even though nothing, as usual, nothing much came of it. But no, that was the situation. The person she was taking back, and I'm embarrassed to say I've forgotten his name, faked being shot. He fell under her when she was shot and the car wrecked. She fell on top of him. He was covered in blood, and they stopped and realized that she was dead and thought he was too.
Now, Dr. Carter, in your book, The Politics of Rage, the 1972 shooting, Arthur Bremer, there's quite a discussion about potential conspiracy with the Nixon campaign to have shot Governor Wallace. Jack Nelson, former erstwhile bureau chief of the LA Times, Pulitzer Prize winner, came down, investigated it. What's your conclusion?
I don't think so. I just do not believe that Richard Nixon and his entourage tried to exploit the shooting. But Arthur Bremer, we have an awful lot of information, including his diaries, all of the diaries he wrote during this period. And it's clear that this is a very mentally disturbed young man.
Peggy Wallace Kennedy, after your father was shot, what was his life like as governor and his personal life?
Well, of course, he slowed down quite a bit, and I think that even though that was such a tragedy for him, I do think that it helped him in a lot of ways to stop and look around and appreciate his family more and appreciate what he had more. Unfortunately, it had to happen in that way.
And your father was married twice after your mother died, correct? To Cornelia?
Right.
And then also to Lisa Taylor?
Right.
Okay. All right. And divorced from both?
Right.
And one thing I do want to point out is that here at the governor's mansion here in Montgomery, Alabama, in the back is a pool. And I guess it was put in as a gift to Governor Wallace after he was paralyzed, because swimming would be good for him, and it's in the shape of the state of Alabama. Dr. Reed, did you remember your last conversation with George Wallace?
No, I was trying to. I just do remember one of the final statements we had with him, and that was he was saying that, he said to me, he said, Joe said, a lot of folks said I didn't believe in what I was doing. He said, I believed in segregation. He said, we were all taught that way. He said, but I was wrong. And said, therefore, he came to folks for forgiveness. And so I accepted his decision, and that I accepted his statement that he was wrong, because he's one of the few Southern politicians ever to repudiate that. And I finally, in fact, I was invited to come to his funeral, and I did go to the church where his funeral was, and I think that as a Christian he should have been forgiven and was forgiven.
Peggy Wallace Kennedy, where are your parents buried?
They are buried at Leak Memory Cemetery, and they are together.
Is that here in Montgomery?
It's here in Montgomery, yes.
Okay. And finally, Dr. Dan Carter, how did George Wallace change the national conversation?
Well, he certainly identified this mood that was in its very early stages of conservatism. And it was made possible not only by his great skills, but by circumstances over which he had no control, but which he was able to exploit, I think, because of that. To me, though, the great tragedy is that here was a person of enormous ability, but was caught in the time warp that he was.
The Politics of Rage is the name of Dan Carter's book. He has been our guest for the last 2 hours, as has Joe Reed, who is chairman of the Alabama Democratic Conference, as well as the executive secretary of the
Associate
Executive Secretary of the Alabama Education Association. And we're very happy to have also joined us Peggy Wallace Kennedy, the daughter of George Wallace, and we thank you all very much. We also want to thank Governor Robert Bentley for opening up his temporary home here for us to broadcast from out front. It's a beautiful night in Montgomery. It's been wonderful, so thank you, Governor Bentley, who is the current governor of Alabama. We also want to thank from the governor's mansion staff, James Camp and Heather Hanna, and thanks to everybody at the Alabama State Capitol building for all their help in setting up this Contenders. And we're going to leave you with Governor Wallace in 1986, his last address to the Alabama legislature. Good night.
I feel that I must say that I've climbed my last political mountain, but there's still some personal hills I must climb. But for now, I must pass the rope and the pick to another climber and say, climb on to high heights, climb on till you reach the very peak. Then look back and wave at me. I too will still be climbing. My fellow Alabamians, I bid you a fond and affectionate farewell.